This is the time of the meeting where I get to make sort of a state of the industry address. The theme of this year's conference is Vision, Leadership, Growth. And I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about that because the NGV industry finds itself at an inflection point. And how we deal with the challenges that we're going to face over the next few years could decide, and probably will decide, the future course of the industry. Let me start with the growth part of that Vision, Leadership, Growth. A recent Frost and Sullivan study predicts that by 2017, which is just 5 years from now, less than 5 years from now, about 8% of North America's Class 6 or 8 vehicles are going to be NGVs, with sales of almost 30,000 annually in 2017. A recent PIRA consulting study forecasts that natural gas demand in fleet vehicles could be 5.1 trillion cubic feet by 2030. That's over 20% of the current gas consumption in all applications, residential, commercial, industrial, power gen. It's also 113 times what we're using now in natural gas vehicles. Now that's their high case. But even in their low case, PIRA forecasts that gas consumption could be 2.5 trillion cubic feet by 2030, which is only 57 times what we're using today. And these are huge numbers. And you just heard from Mike, 50% potentially. Thank you, Jeff Clark, for delving into the backup, by the way, 1,300-page study, but the backup is monstrous. And finding, going through the analysis. They didn't do forecasts, but they did do a lot of scenarios, right? 3,000 scenarios. And if you look at the aggressive natural gas one, it's 50%, that's the high side, 50% heavy-duty market, 50% light-duty market, 35% in the medium-duty market. These are heady numbers. Everyone here is an optimist when it comes to NGVs. If you weren't an optimist, you wouldn't be in this business. But I doubt if anybody or many people in this audience could have anticipated this kind of growth just 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. It's really remarkable. How did this happen? I mean, how did we go from one of a number of alternative fuels to the consensus alternative fuel against gasoline and diesel? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. But a quote in the recent issue of Heavy Duty Trucking magazine sums up the primary reason pretty well. It says, for some people, it's greenhouse gases. For some people, it's dependence on foreign oil. For some, it's emissions. For the other 99%, it's money. Which basically, ties right into what Mike said. It's that simple. If we can show individuals and businesses at least a 3-year payback on their investment, they're going to be interested. And if we're saving them $1.50 to $2 a gallon at the pump, we can demonstrate that payback for a growing percentage of customers out there. But money isn't the only reason. Certainly the primary reason, not the only reason. If you don't have vehicles, it doesn't matter how cheap the fuel is. So vehicle diversity and vehicle quality is another reason. In the heavy-duty area, you got Freightliner and Volvo and Mack, and Kenworth, Peterbilt, Navistar. They're all making natural gas vehicles. A few years ago, it had been hard to anticipate that. And with the introduction of the 11.9-liter Cummins Westport engine in just a few months, there's going to be even more natural gas truck choices. Meanwhile, the streamlining of EPA certification requirements last year, because of that, we're now seeing a growing number of companies offering heavy-duty conversions. Heavy-duty, some dual fuel, some dedicated. And as the list of those things grow, as we get more conversion companies, more conversion systems for more models, more and more of that 8 million diesel vehicles on the road that are already on the road become viable NGV prospects. In the medium-duty market, I don't even have time to mention all the companies that are making natural gas vehicles, but I'll mention two. I'll mention Chrysler, which is making a biofuel pickup truck, And I'll mention General Motors, which is offering a biofuel pickup truck and a dedicated medium-duty van. In the light-duty area, you just have to go to our website and look at the list of all the companies doing and offering NGV conversions. It's a very impressive list. As to OEMs, currently Honda is still the only one that's producing light-duty OEM natural gas vehicle, but that's going to change. I really think that's going to change quickly. In July, 22 states signed on to an OEM RFP for a group buy of light-duty vehicles for states' fleets. Yesterday, they made their announcement. They made some announcement. I read it. It was unintelligible. But today, I read it. I said, it didn't say anything. But today, they're supposed to have much more detail about what's in that announcement. And this afternoon, we're going to have representatives from two of the lead states, Colorado and Oklahoma, that are going to be on the program to explain the RFP results, I hope, and explain what it all means. We will be seeing more light-duty NGV OEM soon. I guarantee that. And I haven't even mentioned the huge off-road market, locomotives, marine applications, construction equipment. These markets are just in their infancy for NGVs. But for those of you who read our weekly newsletter religiously, and I know who you are, as you can attest, there are announcements over almost every week about something in this area. My point here is that with a growing number of companies offering NGVs, and a growing number of people using NGVs, and a growing number of companies that are providing components to NGVs, we're seeing improvements in technology, we're seeing economies of scale, and we're seeing competition. And this, in turn, is bringing down our first cost premium, just like Mike showed. It's going to come down over time. And coupled with our significant fuel cost advantage, more and more customers are seeing NGVs as falling in that magic 3-year payback period. A third reason the NGV forecasts are also so positive is we're finally getting a real infrastructure out there. The naysayers point to us, and I'm sure these are the naysayers who were on Mike's committee, and say there's 150,000 gasoline stations out there. You're never going to replicate that with CNG. And our response is we don't have to replicate that right now to start growing right now. One station in an industrial park can serve 20 or more return-to-home fleets. As the word spreads and that one station becomes 2 stations, becomes 3 stations, and continues to grow, we have pretty soon an adequate, sufficient infrastructure within any community to begin attracting non-return-to-home fleets and even consumers. And that's what happened in Los Angeles, and that's what happened in Salt Lake City, and that's what's happening in communities around the country. Now, right now, we only have about 1,100 stations, CNG stations. But we're adding about 20 or 25 a month, and that number is going to really crank up. Those stations they're not just evenly spread across the country, they're clustered into urban hubs. And as these hubs grow, the hubs are being connected by spokes, by corridors, by NGV stations along interstate highways. Through this hub and spoke concept, the NGV station infrastructure for CNG is growing organically. We're growing from the bottom up. But to capture the over-the-road market, potentially a huge market for us, a bottom-up strategy really won't work. We need a top-down station-first strategy. And we're fortunate that 2 companies have stepped up to address that, to provide that basic framework for this national NGV or LNG fueling infrastructure network. Clean Energy, they're well on their way to building 150 LNG stations and possibly some LCNG stations at pilot Flying J truck stops about 250 miles apart at the intersection of interstate highways all across the country. And Shell, they've announced that they are going to build 100 LNG fueling stations at travel center truck stops. When you spread them out around the country, 250 miles apart, you get a lot of the country being covered. These stations, coupled with the OEM NGV offerings and a great economic story, mean that we can and we will capture the over-the-road market. All these studies basically assume that and say that. Okay, we got economics, we got vehicles, and we got infrastructure. Why else are these forecasts so positive? How about government policy? Recently, when asked about the need for federal incentives to jumpstart the NGV market, Boone Pickens said, he said this, he said, the market is going to happen, and we don't have to have Washington do it. Now, Boone is right. We don't need federal support to grow. We don't need federal support, but we could grow a lot faster if we do get encouragement from Washington. And while our legislative cornerstone, the Nat Gas Act, continues to be held hostage by political infighting in Congress, there are clear signs that Washington is increasingly becoming an NGV supporter. Why? Well, it's simple. If you look at the situation, natural gas is one of the few bright spots in the entire economic system we have in the United States. As MIT and others have said, it's a game changer. And obviously, you know, Mike's organization, the National Petroleum Council, sort of came to that same conclusion. And the best way to take advantage of that, obviously, is to actually produce the gas and then use it in all applications, but especially into vehicles. There's now a growing realization among the national policymakers that natural gas addresses many of the critical needs of the country. We add jobs, we improve the balance of trade by backing out imports, and we lower the transportation costs. All this puts more money to work here in the United States to make businesses stronger, to make the economy stronger. So it shouldn't be a surprise that we have 180 co-sponsors, bipartisan co-sponsors of the Nat Gas Act. And there are many more in Congress that are not sponsors of the bill that privately say they support us. In fact, it's now clear that because we have this huge natural gas resource base, and there's a realization that it's there, that almost everyone in Congress that we talk to tell us they support the growing market for natural gas vehicles. Now, they'll differ on whether government has a role in that, but the end point they all agree on. So that's Congress. How about the administration? Well, there's a lot going on here, too. In January, President Obama actually mentioned natural gas in vehicles in his State of the Union address. It's the first time that ever happened. Later that month, he's standing before NGVs, big trucks at the UPS Center in Las Vegas. The president unveiled his blueprint to make the most of America's energy resources. Not catchy, but that's the name of it. This was the president's program in support of natural gas vehicles, in which he called for passage of NGV incentives, a grant program, a national grant program for communities, funding for NGV corridors, and NGV R&D. And later on, a month later, he also announced his $30 million NGV R&D solicitation through ARPA that we talked about yesterday. Meanwhile, in the agencies, EPA and NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, they've recently finalized emission and efficiency regulations for the future heavy-duty and light-duty vehicles, in which they included a lot of NGV incentives. The Federal Transit Administration, which provides funding for buses, they've announced recently millions of dollars for an NGV bus program. DOE announced a $5 million program where natural gas vehicles are a major player. There's more. There's a lot of these examples. There's no big thing, but a lot of these little examples. We've never had this kind of support from any administration. That's real progress. But fortunately for NGVs, government doesn't just mean Washington. The real support we're getting is coming from the states. I've already mentioned that 22-state NGV RFP. But states are supporting NGVs in a number of ways. Many states have in place substantial NGV financial and other incentives. For example, Louisiana and Oklahoma, West Virginia, and other states have state tax credits. And other states like California and Pennsylvania and Texas have large grant programs. And more programs like that are coming. Since January, 250 pieces of legislation, over 250 pieces of legislation have been introduced in the 50 state houses that support alternative fuel vehicles, and natural gas is a player in almost all of them, most of them. So because of all this, it should be no surprise that the studies I mentioned are so optimistic about the potential for NGV growth. But the key word here is potential. This is how the future could be. It doesn't mean this is how the future necessarily must be. And it's here where the other two parts of vision, growth, and leadership come in. Vision and leadership. Growth is great, but the kind of growth we're talking about here is going to offer us some special challenges. It's already offering us special challenges. Each of you need to provide that leadership and vision within your own companies to deal with that kind of growth. But we also need the vision and leadership as an industry to identify today those impediments that tomorrow could stand in the way of that significant exponential growth, and then take steps to remove them. Let me mention a couple things, a couple impediments that could really affect us. The campaign against fracking. The major reason, obviously, that we have the big price advantage against petroleum is that fracking has permitted the inexpensive and prolific production of natural gas from shale. Unfortunately, as everybody here knows, there is a cottage industry out there that has grown up to ban fracking. The producers are fighting. They're fighting back. But it can't just be their job. It's all of our jobs. We all need to get smart on the details of that debate. If you haven't seen Gasland, Gasland is the film that basically lays out the case against fracking, however awful everything is. If you haven't seen it, watch it. Then watch Truthland. Truthland is the film that point out all the lies in Gasland. Watch them both. You can see them both on YouTube. Truthland, Gasland. All of us need to be educated ambassadors for gas production, because without that, we're in trouble. Second, NGV safety. We talked about this a lot yesterday, and those of you at the Technology Committee, the CVF Technology Committee, also heard a lot of discussion. The U.S. NGV industry has an extraordinary safety record. That didn't just happen. It's a result of good and evolving codes and standards and effective government regulation. Unfortunately, now that the demand for NGVs is really taking off, we're starting to see the charlatans come out. Some are selling inferior tanks and conversion systems, even damaged tanks and expired tanks to individuals. Some of these are internet sales. Some of this equipment doesn't even meet minimum national safety or emission standards. Meanwhile, some people are getting into the installation business without having the proper training. At best, the customers of these companies are going to have a bad NGV experience. That's bad enough. At worst, someone's going to get killed or hurt. If you run into a company that's doing this, if you run into somebody who's selling this kind of equipment, let us know. We'll work with you to try to make this information available to the proper authorities, and we're working nationally, as you heard in those discussions the last 2 days, to figure out a way to actually get this equipment off the streets. Also, we urge you to work with your colleagues to make sure, and this is where we would like to help you, to make sure that the states adequately regulate these programs to ensure NGV conversion safety. We have a model state legislation that we can provide you. Safety always, always has to be our #1 priority. It's got to trump growth. We have to have safe product. Another possible impediment, government officials. Aren't the people in Colorado or Oklahoma, the NGV, the folks, lucky that their governors and senior state officials are so knowledgeable about NGVs? Luck had nothing to do with it. No one is born knowing the advantages of NGVs. These policymakers have that knowledge because some individuals and companies in those states took the time and effort to educate them. Moreover, this is a never-ending process because elected officials and their staffs and other policymakers at the state and local and regional level, they change all the time. The fact is that these policymakers want to know about this stuff. You're doing them a service by going in and educate them. As with safety, Educating policymakers, local, state, and federal, is not somebody else's job. It's everybody's job. It's your job. You have to get involved in that. If we don't educate these policymakers about NGVs, our competitors will educate them about NGVs. And everybody knows that that's a real bad idea, to have your competitors carry your message for you. Speaking of education, customer education. Boy, is there a lot of misinformation out there. Misinformation about NGVs. You see it in the media, you see it on letters to the editor, you see it on blog postings, and you certainly see it when you go in and talk to customers about making a potential sale. Now, we can never eliminate the misinformation, but we can minimize it, but we can't do it alone. We need the help of our allies, especially the allies that the customers trust. These include the customers' state associations or trade associations and their national associations and organizations like Clean Cities. It's our job to reach out and make sure that these organizations have our information, credible, accurate information about NGVs. Now, these are a few examples. There are other examples out there of impediments. We need OEMs involved in promoting NGVs. We have to make sure that the codes and standards continue to evolve as technology changes. We have to work to lower the cost of NGVs and fueling infrastructure. And we have to identify and resolve the bottlenecks in the supply chain. This is going to be a big one if we get that growth going up as fast as it's going to happen. Now, obviously, many of these challenges are being addressed and must be addressed by individual companies. But many also need to be addressed through collective action, by working together as an industry. And NGVAmerica stands ready and is already working with all of you on these issues and will continue to work on these issues as new ones come about to try to get these impediments resolved. When John D. Rockefeller was starting out making gasoline from petroleum, he had a vision. He had a vision for his company and his industry that has become our current reality. Today, we in the NGV industry have a vision that's different, a different reality for tomorrow. We see NGVs in every application and as common as gasoline vehicles today. We see a natural gas fueling infrastructure everywhere. We see NGVs in the future as unremarkable as cell phones and bottled water. We have the vision, and we will have the growth, because we also have the leadership, and that's you, the leaders of the industry, leaders in your companies. You're the people that are going to make this happen. Vision, leadership, growth. It is a very exciting time to be in the NGV industry. Thank you.